I'm going to talk to you guys about how to do a conclusion. So in the conclusion, you're going to want to state the aims of your study. And so some people, the way that they do it is they'll state the three aims. The first aim was to do this, or the first goal was to do this, and the second goal was to do this, and the third goal was to do this. And then they'll start talking about what the results were. I prefer to do it. I say one of the aims was, or one of the goals was to find this, or to assess this, and this is what we found. And so I'll kind of go into my paper and kind of show you what I did. So first, I provided a general statement of what the main overarching or overall goal of the paper was, to provide a synopsis of the research on heart disease and depression. And so then I talk about the first aim. So the first aim is to assess that if depression is a risk factor for heart disease. So I said it can be concluded that depression is a risk factor for heart disease. And then I talk about, so each of these big sections that I used here, where I talked in great detail about different topics, I basically say one sentence about each of these big, long sections that I did where I talked in detail. So I gave one sentence. Let me go back. So I said one sentence about depression and heart disease was associated with a physiological response to stress. And I use specifically, so sometimes when you don't clearly state something, or you make a broad statement, or maybe the article says more stuff than, just a general statement, you want to maybe give a second sentence to express that, in more detail. And so specifically is a good connector to do that. So I like to use that. So specifically, depressed individuals have an excited response to stressors, which can lead to immune system dysfunction, extreme heart rates, abnormal clotting speed, which are all associated with heart disease. So the summarized research on anxiety disorders, identified anxiety disorders as a risk factor for heart disease. And then I connect it again. So furthermore, or in turn, or, in addition, and comorbid, or people with anxiety and depression, put an individual at an even higher risk for heart disease than being diagnosed with anxiety, depression, or alone. And social support was identified as a possible predictive factor for depression and later heart disease development. So I basically, in these long, sentences where I talked about each of these things in a paragraph or more, I just summarized them in the conclusion in one sentence, and put all of them together in a paragraph, and kind of wrap that part up. Now, my second aim here is the literature on depression following heart disease treatment was also summarized. So this is the second aim that I had. Heart disease treatment was identified as a risk factor for depression. So people who got diagnosed with heart disease were more likely to get depression after, which is understandable. Someone who gets diagnosed with heart disease may, feel depressed after that. And so the literature suggests identifying depression among patients with heart disease is a challenge. So figuring out which patients who get heart disease who have depression is difficult. Recommendations are quick depression screeners for cardiologists were discussed. Overall, depression was associated with an increased mortality risk among patients with heart disease. So depression, obviously heart disease lowers your life expectancy, but people with depression who have heart disease have an even lower life expectancy than people with just heart disease. And the research suggests, so I go into even more detail, the reason that they have a lower life expectancy is because they have unhealthy habits. And so you're probably thinking, well, what are those unhealthy habits? And then in the next sentence, I say, furthermore, depressed patients were less likely than I could have probably put, for example, here. That may have been a better. For example, depressed patients with heart disease were less likely than non-depressed patients or non-depressed treatment to quit smoking, exercise, eat healthy, and take their medication as instructed. And that should be patients, not treatment. So then the final aim, so I talked about the second aim, and then the final aim, the research on the efficacy, or whether or not it's working. That's what efficacy means, whether or not it's actually working, of psychosocial interventions for patients with Heart disease and depression were highlighted. Treatments have a marginal, which means an okay, it works, but not great effect on depressive symptoms. However, when the treatment is effective, heart disease symptoms have a positive effect on depressive symptoms. Financial stress was identified as the most significant barrier to successful treatment among depression, for depression among patients with heart disease. So financial stress can affect that negatively. And then I tie it, at the end, I basically say the results of this literature review hope to inform future clinicians about the relationship between heart disease and depression. And so, like I said, I've basically outlined the 3 aims, tied them all together, talked about everything that I talk about in my paper, but do it briefly in, 1 sentence. And then at the end, I, tie together with just a final concluding statement here.